Suffrage for non-property owners and African Americans. From about 1900 to 1965, most African Americans were not allowed to vote in the South. This was especially true in the Deep South, like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina. White people in power used many methods to keep African Americans from voting. Some of these methods also prevented poor white people and non-property owners from voting. One of those methods was violence. Blacks who tried to vote were threatened, beaten, and killed. Their families were also harmed. Sometimes their homes were burned down, often they lost their jobs or were thrown off their farms. Whites used violence to intimidate blacks and prevent them from even thinking about voting. Still, some blacks passed the requirements to vote and took the risk. Some whites used violence to punish those uppity people and show other blacks what would happen to them if they voted. Literacy test. Today, almost all adults can read. 100 years ago, however, many people, black and white, were illiterate. Most illiterate people were not allowed to vote. A few were allowed if they could understand what was read to them. White officials usually claimed that whites could understand what was read. They said blacks could not understand it, even if they could. The third method's property test. In the South 100 years ago, many states allowed only property owners to vote. Many blacks and whites had no property and could not vote. Another method was the grandfather clause. People who could not read and owned no property were not allowed to vote if their grandfathers or grandfathers hadn't before 1867. Of course, practically no blacks could vote before 1867, so the grandfather clause worked only for whites. Another was all-white primary elections. In the U.S., there are usually 2 rounds of elections. First the primary, then the general. In the primary, Republicans run against Republicans and Democrats run against Democrats. In the general election, the winner of the Republican primary runs against the winner of the Democratic primary. The Republican or Democrat who gets the most votes is elected. In the South from about 1900 to about 1960, the Democratic candidates usually won. Republicans were almost never elected, especially in the Deep South. This means that the Democratic primary election was usually the only election that mattered. African Americans were not allowed to vote in the Democratic primary elections. White Democrats said the Democratic Party was a club and did not allow black members, so blacks could not vote in the only elections that mattered. Another method was purges. From time to time, white officials purged the voting rolls. This means they took people's names off the official list of voters. Some voters would arrive at the polls and find that they were not registered to vote. Often they could not register to vote again until after the election. Purges more often affected blacks than whites. People who had gone to prison were often not allowed to vote. Blacks were very often arrested and on trumped up charges or for minor offenses. Sometimes white owners of mines, farms, and factories simply needed cheap labor and prisons provided it. This law kept more blacks from voting than whites. Poll taxes. In the southern states, people had to pay a tax to vote. These taxes were about $25 to $50 in today's money. Many people had extremely low incomes and could not afford this tax. This poll tax applied to all people who wanted to vote, black and white. There were ways for whites to get around other laws, but not around the poll tax. Many poor whites could not vote because of the poll tax.
Okay, women's suffrage was ratified on August 18, 1920. The 19th Amendment of the United States Constitution guaranteed American women right to vote, also known as women's suffrage. At the time the U.S. was founded, the female citizens did not share all the same rights as men, including the right to vote. It was not until 1848 that the movement for women's right to vote, or women's rights, launched on a national level with a convention in New York organized by abolitionist Elizabeth Cady and Mott. The following convention was a demand for the vote became a centerpiece of women's rights movement. Stanton and Mott, along with Susan B. Anthony and other activists, formed organizations that raised public awareness and lobbied the government to grant voting rights to women. After a 70-year battle, these groups finally emerged victorious with the passage of the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment guarantees all American women the right to vote. Achieving this milestone required a lengthy and difficult struggle. The victory took decades of aggression and protest. Beginning in the mid-19th century, several generations of women suffrage supporters wrote, marched, and lobbied and practiced civil disobedience to achieve what many Americans considered a racial change of the Constitution. Few early supporters lived to see the final victory in 1920. The 15th Amendment guaranteed African American men the right to vote by declaring that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Although ratified on February 3, 1870, the promise of the 15th Amendment would not be fully realized for almost a century. Although through the use of poll tax, lottery tests, and other means, Southern states were able to effectively disfranchise African Americans, it would take the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 before the majority of African Americans in the South were registered to vote. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, allowing millions of young people to exercise the right to vote and shape their own political future. The 26th Amendment was passed faster than any constitutional amendment in history. But that does not mean it was easier. It was an easy process. It took a group of young activists from the National Education Association and their allies to harness the energy of students' activism in the 1960s and make the dream a reality. The slogan, "Old enough to fight, old enough to vote," gained popularity. The 24th Amendment of the United States Constitution prohibits both Congress and states from making citizens pay to gain the right to vote or any other type of poll tax.
These drastically changed the political system. When women were able to vote, they began to vote women into office. Same for African Americans and poor people.